Hello. Tonight, you step into the harshest, darkest, most remote life of the Pleistocene winter, a world of immense ice and profound, silent cold. Before starting this video, which is only for you, relaxing and helping you sleep by clearing your mind, it would be a great support to us if you wrote where and when you watched it in the comments and subscribed. Why you'd freeze in the Ice Age? Ancient humans mastered skills we forgot. The world that presented itself to human consciousness some 25,000 years ago, during the glacial maximum of the last great ice age, was not a landscape of gentle hills and verdant forests, but was instead a vast and almost featureless canvas of profound and unrelenting cold, a planet that was fundamentally and in almost every conceivable way, more hostile to the survival of a warm-blooded primate than the modern Earth. The very quality of the light was different. A thin and perpetually low-angled sun that cast long blue shadows across an immense, wind-swept steppe, a pale and distant disk that offered little in the way of tangible warmth, its energy serving only to create a brilliant and often blinding glare on the surface of the endless ice sheets that smothered the northern latitudes. The environment was not merely cold in the sense of a low ambient temperature, but was a dynamic and multifaceted system of cold, a world defined by the constant and abrasive presence of a wind that swept, unimpeded, across thousands of miles of frozen tundra and glacier, a wind that carried with it a fine dry powder of ice crystals that scoured the skin and penetrated every seam of a garment, a wind that made the simple act of breathing a painful and conscious effort. This was a world where the very ground beneath one's feet was frozen solid to a depth of hundreds, and in some places thousands of feet, a state of permafrost that turned the earth into a substance as hard and unyielding as stone, a landscape where the familiar cycles of growth and decay seemed to have been suspended in a state of indefinite, cryogenic stasis. The human organism that moved through this environment was itself a different kind of biological machine, a body and a mind that had been shaped and hardened by countless generations of direct and unforgiving exposure to these conditions, a being whose fundamental physiological and psychological relationship with the concept of cold was so radically different from that of a modern, centrally heated human as to be almost unrecognizable. The ancient human did not experience the cold as an occasional and unpleasant intrusion into a life of temperate comfort, but as the permanent and unchangeable background state of the universe, a constant and ever-present physical reality that was as natural and as unremarkable as the air itself. Their bodies were physiologically adapted to this reality in ways that are now largely lost to our species, with a higher basal metabolic rate and a greater distribution of the specialized thermogenic brown adipose tissue that allowed them to generate internal heat with a far greater efficiency. Their very perception of the world was conditioned by this reality, their senses attuned not to the subtle shifts in warmth that define our modern experience, but to the minute and life or death variations in the nature of the cold. The subtle shift in the wind that might presage a coming blizzard, the specific texture of the snow that could indicate a hidden crevasse or a safe path, the almost imperceptible change in the air pressure that signaled a change in the weather. This was not a life of heroic, moment-to-moment survival against a hostile wilderness, but was a slow, monotonous, and deeply accustomed existence within a world of cold, a state of being in which the fundamental assumptions about comfort, safety, and the nature of the physical world were entirely and profoundly alien to our own. This biologically prepared organism, however, was still a fragile thing of flesh and blood, its long-term persistence dependent entirely on the creation of a second, artificial skin, a meticulously engineered technological barrier against the lethal and ever-present reality of the cold. The first and most critical line of defense against the profound and life-extinguishing cold of the glacial environment was not a static shelter of rock or bone, but was the creation of a personal, mobile microenvironment in the form of meticulously crafted clothing, a technological system that was so sophisticated in its design and so demanding in its production that it represents one of the great, largely forgotten intellectual achievements of early humanity. The clothing worn by the inhabitants of the Ice Age was not a simple, drape-like covering of unprepared animal hides, but was a fully tailored and multi-layered ensemble of garments, the product of a long and complex manufacturing process that required a deep, scientific understanding of materials, a set of highly specialized tools, and an immense investment of time and skilled labor. The process began with the careful selection of the raw materials, an act that was in itself a demonstration of a profound and intimate knowledge of the local fauna. Different animal hides were not interchangeable commodities, but were understood to possess a unique and specific set of physical properties that made them suitable for different applications. The hide of the reindeer, or caribou, was highly prized for its exceptional insulating properties, a quality derived from the unique structure of its hair, which is hollow and traps a significant amount of air, creating a light and incredibly warm material that was ideal for the primary, insulating layers of a garment, such as a parka or trousers. The skin of a wolf or a wolverine, by contrast, was valued not for its warmth but for its unique resistance to frost, a property that made its fur the ideal material for the ruffs of a parka hood, as the moisture from human breath would not freeze and accumulate upon it. The skins of smaller, more delicate animals, such as the Arctic fox or the hare, were used for the soft, insulating linings of mittens and boots, while the tougher, more durable hides of larger herbivores like the bison or the horse were used for the soles of footwear and for the creation of rawhide cordage. The transformation of these raw, perishable hides into a durable, flexible, and weather-resistant material was the next and most labor-intensive phase of the process, a complex and physically demanding procedure known as tanning. The fresh hide would first be painstakingly scraped clean of all remaining flesh and fat using a specialized stone scraper, a repetitive and arduous task that required considerable strength and stamina. The hide would then be treated with a tanning agent, the most effective and widely used of which was the brain of the animal itself, a substance that is rich in the emulsifying fats and lecithins that are necessary to break down the stiff collagen fibers of the skin and to render it permanently soft and pliable. The brain would be mashed into a paste with water and laboriously worked into the hide by hand, a process that was followed by a long period of stretching, wringing, and smoking over a smoldering fire, which would complete the chemical transformation and imbue the finished leather with a durable, water-resistant, and smoke-scented quality. The final stage of the process was the design and assembly of the garments themselves, a task that demonstrated a level of tailoring skill that would not be seen again in many parts of the world for thousands of years. The tanned hides were cut into carefully shaped, interlocking patterns using razor-sharp flint blades, and these individual pieces were then meticulously stitched together using an eyed needle, which was typically carved from a sliver of bone or ivory, and a strong, durable thread that was made from the dried and shredded sinew of an animal's leg. The archaeological evidence, in the form of exquisitely fine bone needles and the microscopic analysis of wear patterns on stone tools, suggests a level of skill in this process that was truly masterful, with the creation of strong, flat, and weatherproof seams that were essential for the garment's thermal integrity. The final product was a multi-layered system, often consisting of an inner layer worn with the fur turned towards the body for maximum insulation, and an outer, weatherproof layer worn with the leather side facing out, a combination that created a personal and highly efficient envelope of warmth that was the absolute and non-negotiable prerequisite for life in the frozen world. This meticulously crafted microenvironment of personal warmth, while essential for movement across the frozen land, was only one half of the solution to the problem of survival, for it had to be complemented by the creation of larger, more static shelters that could provide a refuge from the unceasing wind. The creation of a static and defensible zone of relative warmth, a fixed point of refuge in the vast and featureless landscape of the glacial steppe, was a complex and intellectually demanding challenge that required a profound and deeply intuitive understanding of the principles of thermal engineering, resource management, and the subtle but critical variations in the local topography. The popular conception of the Ice Age shelter as a simple, dark, and damp cave is a significant and misleading oversimplification, for while natural rock shelters were certainly utilized when and where they were available, the majority of the human population lived in environments where such natural features were rare or non-existent, a reality that necessitated the development of a sophisticated and highly varied architectural tradition of constructed dwellings. The selection of a site for such a dwelling was the first and most critical decision in this process, a choice that was guided not by whim or by convenience, but by a careful and multifaceted assessment of the landscape's affordances. The ideal location was one that offered a natural and pre-existing advantage against the single most persistent and life-threatening element of the environment: the wind. A hunter-gatherer group would seek out a location that provided some form of natural windbreak, such as the base of a low cliff, the sheltered side of a small river valley, or a subtle depression in the otherwise flat expanse of the tundra, a place where the relentless, energy-sapping force of the wind was naturally attenuated. The second critical consideration was the proximity to essential resources, most notably a reliable source of water, which in the frozen landscape often meant a river that was large and fast-flowing enough to resist freezing solid, and equally importantly, a location that was strategically situated in relation to the predictable, seasonal migration routes of the great herds of herbivores that were the primary source of the people's food and raw materials. Once a suitable location had been identified, the construction of the dwelling itself was an act of remarkable ingenuity and a testament to the ability of these ancient people to create complex and durable structures from a limited and often unpromising set of locally available materials. In the vast, treeless expanses of the Central and Eastern European plains, where wood was a scarce and precious commodity, the primary building materials were the bones, tusks, and hides of the woolly mammoth, the great keystone species of the Ice Age ecosystem. The archaeological remains of these mammoth bone houses, which have been painstakingly excavated in sites such as Mazyryk in modern-day Ukraine, reveal a level of architectural complexity and sheer, monumental effort that is truly astonishing. The foundation of such a structure was often a circular or oval ring of large, heavy mammoth skulls, which were set into the frozen ground to create a solid and stable base. The main frame of the dwelling was then constructed from a carefully interlocking lattice of mammoth long bones and massive, curving tusks, which were arranged to create a strong, self-supporting, dome-shaped superstructure that was capable of withstanding both the immense weight of the winter snows and the powerful, persistent force of the wind. This heavy, skeletal framework was then covered with a weatherproof and insulating skin, a composite layer that was typically made from a large number of heavy, overlapping mammoth or reindeer hides, which were stitched together and likely weighted down along the edges with smaller bones or stones to create a tight and draft-free seal. The interior of this dwelling, while dark and windowless, was a remarkably effective and thermally efficient space. Its semi-subterranean design and its thick, insulating layers of bone and hide creating a stable and protected microenvironment in which the small, carefully managed fire of the central hearth could maintain a livable, if not comfortable, temperature, a pocket of relative warmth and security that stood in stark and absolute contrast to the lethal sub-zero wilderness that raged just inches away on the other side of the thin hide and bone membrane. The construction of a single one of these dwellings was a massive and time-consuming communal undertaking, a project that would have required the coordinated labor of the entire social group over a period of many weeks and which represented a significant and long-term investment in a particular location on the landscape. The internal environment of the Ice Age dwelling, whether it was a natural cave or a complex, constructed hut of bone and hide, was organized and managed with a level of care and a degree of spatial sophistication that belied its seemingly primitive and rustic nature. The central and defining feature of this interior world, the absolute and non-negotiable heart of the domestic and social space, was the fire. The hearth was not merely a source of warmth, light, and a means for cooking food, but was a powerful and deeply symbolic focal point for the entire community, a tamed and domesticated piece of the sun that had been brought into the human realm and which served as the primary and essential barrier against the encroaching and life-extinguishing forces of the cold and the dark. The management of this fire was a task of the utmost and continuous importance, a critical responsibility that required a deep and practical understanding of the principles of combustion and a relentless, daily investment of labor. The fuel for these fires, in the largely treeless environment of the glacial steppe, was not primarily wood, which was a scarce and highly valued resource that was likely reserved for the construction of tool handles and other essential items, but was instead the dried and rendered bones and the fat of the very animals that the people hunted for their food. The bones of large mammals, such as the mammoth and the bison, are rich in the fatty marrow and collagen that, when subjected to a sufficient initial heat, will burn slowly, steadily, and with a surprising intensity, producing a long-lasting and relatively smokeless fire that was ideally suited for the enclosed and poorly ventilated space of the Ice Age dwelling. The collection and processing of this essential fuel source was a constant and laborious chore, requiring the butchering of animal carcasses not only for their meat and their hides, but also for their combustible skeletal and adipose tissues, and the careful drying and storage of these materials to ensure a continuous and reliable supply of energy through the long, dark months of the winter. The hearth itself was a carefully constructed and well-maintained piece of engineering, often a shallow, clay-lined pit that was designed to contain the fire safely and to maximize its heat output, and it was frequently surrounded by a pavement of carefully laid stones that would absorb the heat from the fire and then slowly radiate it back into the living space, creating a more stable and evenly distributed thermal environment. The space around the central hearth was not an undifferentiated jumble, but was a highly organized and socially significant landscape, a domestic geography that was divided into distinct zones for different activities. The archaeological evidence from excavated cave floors and hut interiors reveals a consistent and recurring pattern of spatial organization, with specific areas of the dwelling being consistently dedicated to particular tasks, such as the knapping of stone tools, the preparation of food, the sewing of clothing, or the performance of ritual activities, a silent and stony testament to the complex and rule-governed nature of the social and domestic life that unfolded around the vital, life-sustaining glow of the Ice Age fire. The acquisition of the immense and continuous stream of calories that was necessary to fuel the human body's high-energy struggle against the perpetual cold was the primary and all-consuming economic activity of the Ice Age hunter-gatherer group, a relentless and intellectually demanding pursuit that was predicated on a deep, scientific, and multi-generational understanding of the behavior and the ecology of the great migratory herds of large mammals that dominated the Pleistocene landscape. This was not a process of random, opportunistic scavenging or the simple, hopeful pursuit of isolated animals, but was a highly strategic and systematically executed logistical operation, a form of resource management that was as complex and as intellectually sophisticated as the agricultural and pastoral systems that would eventually replace it. The foundation of this entire subsistence economy was an encyclopedic and minutely detailed knowledge of the animal world, a vast and orally transmitted body of information that encompassed the life cycles, the seasonal movements, the dietary preferences, and the subtle behavioral cues of a wide range of prey species, from the colossal and slow-moving woolly mammoth to the swift and wary wild horse and the vast, river-like herds of the reindeer. This knowledge was not abstract or academic, but was a practical and deeply empirical science, the product of thousands of years of continuous, close-range observation, a process of trial and error that had been honed and refined over countless generations and the results of which were encoded in the stories, the songs, and the artistic traditions of the people. The hunters knew, with a certainty that was born of this deep and intimate familiarity, precisely where and when the great herds would appear on the landscape, their movements governed by the predictable and unchanging cycles of the seasons, as they followed the northward advance of the summer grazing lands and the southward retreat of the winter snows. The technology that was developed to harvest this mobile and often dangerous source of protein and fat was a direct and elegant expression of this deep ecological knowledge, a specialized and highly effective toolkit of stone, bone, and wood that was designed to overcome the formidable natural defenses of the great Pleistocene megafauna. The primary and most iconic weapon of the Ice Age hunter was the spear, but this was not the simple handheld thrusting spear of earlier hominids, but was a far more sophisticated and aerodynamically refined projectile weapon, a lightweight and flexible dart that was launched not with the power of the arm alone, but with the use of a revolutionary and game-changing piece of technology, the spear thrower or atlatl. This device, which was typically a short, carved piece of wood or antler with a hook or a spur at one end, acted as an artificial extension of the thrower's arm, a simple but profoundly effective lever that could increase the launch velocity, the range, and the penetrating power of the spear by a factor of 3 or more. This technological innovation fundamentally altered the dynamic between the hunter and his prey, transforming the hunt from a close-range and exceptionally dangerous confrontation into a more distant and calculated affair, allowing a small group of hunters to bring down a large and powerful animal from a relatively safe and concealed position. The spear darts themselves were complex, multi-component tools with a long, fletched shaft of wood for stability in flight, and a composite foreshaft and point made of bone, antler, or ivory, which was often armed with a razor-sharp, flaked stone projectile point. These points, which were crafted with a level of skill and an aesthetic sensibility that is often breathtaking, were not designed to kill the animal outright through a single massive wound, but were intended to inflict a deep, penetrating, and heavily bleeding injury that would slowly and inexorably weaken the animal, allowing the hunters to track it over a period of many hours or even days until it finally collapsed from exhaustion and loss of blood. This method of hunting, while highly effective, was also a slow and patient one, a war of attrition that required immense physical stamina, a profound knowledge of tracking, and a deep and stoic psychological resilience on the part of the hunters. The culmination of the hunt, the successful bringing down of a large herd animal such as a bison, a wild horse, or the ultimate prize, a woolly mammoth, was not the end of the labor but was merely the beginning of the most critical and logistically demanding phase of the entire subsistence process: the butchering of the carcass and the transport and processing of its vast and varied resources. The scale of this task was immense, as a single adult mammoth, for example, could weigh 6 tons or more, a colossal mountain of meat, fat, hide, and bone that represented an almost unimaginable windfall of calories and raw materials, but which also presented a formidable and time-sensitive logistical challenge. The initial butchering of the animal had to take place at the kill site, a process that required a coordinated and highly skilled team of individuals working with a specialized toolkit of razor-sharp flint knives and heavy, bone-smashing stone choppers. The first task was the careful removal of the thick, insulating hide, which was a valuable resource in its own right and had to be taken off in large, usable sections, a difficult and physically demanding job that involved a combination of precise cutting and brute force pulling. Once the hide was removed, the process of dismembering the carcass began, a systematic deconstruction of the animal's anatomy that followed a well-established and efficient procedure. The large, meaty haunches and shoulders were severed from the torso. The internal organs, many of which were highly prized for their rich concentration of vitamins and minerals, were carefully removed, and the long bones were broken open to extract the nutrient-dense and highly prized marrow. This entire process was a race against time, as the fresh meat and organs were a powerful attractant to the other, non-human predators and scavengers of the Ice Age landscape, such as the great cave lions, the hyenas, and the packs of wolves, and the butchering party had to work quickly and vigilantly to secure their prize before it was contested by these formidable and ever-present competitors. The transport of the processed meat, hides, and bones from the kill site back to the relative safety of the base camp was another major logistical undertaking, particularly as the kill might have taken place many miles from the hunter's home. The large, heavy sections of meat and the massive, cumbersome hides would have to be hauled across the frozen and often difficult terrain, a task that likely required the coordinated effort of a large number of people, who might have used simple hide-wrapped sledges or simply carried the heavy loads on their backs. Once the resources had been successfully transported back to the camp, a new and equally labor-intensive phase of processing began, a set of tasks that was largely the responsibility of the women and the older members of the community. The vast quantities of fresh meat had to be dealt with immediately to prevent spoilage, a process that involved cutting the meat into thin strips and then preserving it through a combination of air drying and smoking over a low, smoldering fire, which would turn the perishable muscle tissue into a durable, long-lasting, and nutrient-dense form of jerky that could be stored for many months. The thick layers of subcutaneous fat were rendered down in pits filled with fire-heated stones to produce a pure, high-energy tallow that was a critical component of the winter diet and a valuable source of fuel and light. The hides had to be scraped, dehaired, and tanned, and the bones had to be further processed, not only for their marrow but also to be used as fuel for the fire or as the raw material for the creation of tools, needles, and personal ornaments. The successful completion of a major hunt was therefore not a single heroic event, but was a long and complex operational chain, a highly organized and communal process of acquisition, processing, and preservation that required the coordinated and specialized labor of every member of the social group, a system that transformed the violent and unpredictable act of the kill into a predictable and reliable stream of the essential calories and materials that were the absolute and non-negotiable foundation of life in the frozen world. The cognitive toolkit that enabled the successful navigation and exploitation of the vast, monotonous and often disorienting landscape of the Ice Age was not based on the abstract, cartographic principles of modern geography, but was instead a deeply embedded and multisensory form of spatial awareness, a system of wayfinding that was predicated on the creation and maintenance of a detailed and dynamic mental map of the surrounding territory. This was not a map in the conventional sense, a two-dimensional, top-down representation of the world, but was a more holistic and experiential construct, a complex and constantly updated internal model of the environment that was built up over a lifetime of movement and observation, and which was stored and transmitted not in written form, but through the rich and powerful medium of oral tradition, in the form of stories, songs, and place names. The very act of perceiving the landscape was a fundamentally different process for the Ice Age hunter, a form of active and continuous scanning that was focused not on the broad, scenic vistas that might capture the attention of a modern observer, but on the small, subtle, and often almost imperceptible variations in the terrain that were the essential signposts in a world that was largely devoid of obvious or permanent landmarks. The hunter's eye was trained to recognize the slight and gentle rise in the otherwise flat expanse of the tundra that might indicate a dry and well-drained location for a temporary camp, the specific and recurring pattern of polygonal cracks in the frozen ground that could signal the presence of underlying ice wedges, and the subtle shift in the color and texture of the sparse vegetation that might reveal the location of a hidden spring or a mineral lick that would be a reliable attractant for game animals. This detailed visual knowledge of the microtopography was supplemented by a host of other sensory inputs that were woven together to create a rich and multidimensional understanding of the landscape. The direction of the prevailing wind, which in the open, treeless environment of the glacial steppe was often a remarkably constant and reliable indicator of direction, was a fundamental and ever-present navigational aid, a natural and invisible compass that was felt on the skin and heard in the ears. The acoustic properties of the landscape were also a source of valuable information. The specific way that sound carried across a frozen, snow-covered plain, the distant and almost inaudible rumble that might signal the movement of a large herd of animals many miles away, and the sharp, cracking sound of a river's ice breaking up in the spring were all part of a complex and meaningful soundscape that was as legible to the hunter as a written text. Even the sense of smell provided crucial data, the faint, dusty scent of a particular type of rock outcrop, the sharp, ozonic smell of the air that often precedes a snowstorm, and most importantly, the ability to detect the scent of a prey animal on the wind from a great distance were all vital components of this holistic and deeply embodied form of environmental awareness. This intricate mental map was not a static or permanent construct, but was a dynamic and constantly evolving one, a system that had to account for the profound and often dramatic seasonal transformations of the landscape. The hunter's internal geography had to contain at least two and often more distinct versions of the same territory: the white, frozen, and windswept landscape of the deep winter, with its own specific set of travel routes, dangers, and resource locations, and the green, boggy, and insect-plagued landscape of the brief but intense Arctic summer, a world that was in many ways as challenging and as alien as the one it replaced. The ability to move with confidence and purpose across these two profoundly different and constantly shifting worlds was the product of a long and immersive education, a process of learning that began in early childhood and which was based on the simple but effective pedagogical method of direct, lived experience, of walking the land in the company of one's elders and learning to see, to hear, and to feel the world in the same deeply knowledgeable and intimately familiar way. The social and demographic structure of the human groups that navigated this challenging world was a direct and pragmatic adaptation to the specific ecological and economic realities of a life based on the hunting of large, migratory herd animals, a form of social organization that was designed to balance the competing and often contradictory demands of mobility and cooperation. The fundamental unit of Ice Age society was the small, mobile, and intensely flexible residential group, a band of perhaps 25 to 50 individuals, a number that seems to have been a near universal and enduring solution to the problem of organizing a hunter-gatherer economy in a wide variety of environments. This small scale was a functional necessity, as a larger group would have been unable to support itself for any length of time on the thinly and unevenly distributed resources of the glacial landscape, and a smaller group would have lacked the critical mass of able-bodied hunters required to successfully and safely bring down large and dangerous game animals. The membership of these bands was not fixed or permanent, but was likely to have been fluid and constantly shifting, with individuals and families moving between different groups in response to changing social circumstances or ecological conditions, a dynamic that was facilitated by a complex and wide-ranging network of kinship ties that connected the different bands that inhabited a particular region. This larger, regional population, which might have numbered in the hundreds or the low thousands, was the true and enduring social and biological unit, a loose and geographically dispersed community of communities that would have periodically aggregated at specific, traditional locations on the landscape, such as a particularly productive fishing spot or a major river crossing on a caribou migration route, for a period of intense social, economic, and ritual interaction. These seasonal aggregations were a critical component of the broader social system, as they provided an essential opportunity for the exchange of information about the state of the hunting grounds, for the arrangement of marriages between different bands, which was necessary to ensure genetic diversity, and for the performance of the large, communal ceremonies and rituals that served to reinforce the shared cultural identity and the social solidarity of the larger, regional group. The internal structure of the residential band was likely to have been profoundly egalitarian, a social ethos that was not the product of a conscious political or philosophical choice, but was an unavoidable and pragmatic consequence of the economic realities of a life of constant mobility and interdependence. In a society where all property beyond a small and highly portable set of personal tools and clothing was by necessity a communal resource, the accumulation of significant personal wealth, which is the essential prerequisite for the development of rigid social hierarchies, was a practical impossibility. The most important resource of all, the meat from a successful hunt, was a highly perishable commodity that was far too large for a single hunter or his immediate family to consume, a fact that necessitated its immediate and equitable distribution throughout the entire band. This practice of generalized reciprocity, the constant and unconditional sharing of food and other essential resources, was the fundamental and non-negotiable rule of the society, a powerful social leveling mechanism that ensured that no single individual or family could rise to a position of permanent economic dominance over the others. Leadership within the band was also likely to have been of a fluid, informal, and situational nature. While certain individuals, both men and women who were possessed of exceptional skill in a particular domain, such as a particularly successful hunter, a gifted storyteller, or a woman with a deep knowledge of herbal medicine, would have been afforded a high degree of respect and their opinions would have carried great weight in the decision-making process. Their authority was not absolute or coercive, but was based on their demonstrated ability and their willingness to use their talents for the benefit of the group as a whole. This flexible, non-hierarchical, and intensely cooperative social model was a remarkably successful and resilient adaptation to the challenges of the Ice Age world, a system that was capable of mobilizing the coordinated labor required for a large-scale hunt while also providing the social and economic safety net that was necessary to ensure the survival of every individual in a world of profound and ever-present uncertainty. The material culture of the Ice Age hunter-gatherer, the complete and highly portable toolkit of stone, bone, antler, ivory, and wood that was the essential interface between the fragile human organism and the unforgiving physical world, was a testament to a level of technological sophistication and a depth of scientific knowledge that was as profound and as intellectually demanding as any of the more complex, machine-based technologies that would follow it. This was not a technology of brute force or of massive, monumental construction, but was a subtle and highly refined biotechnology, a system that was based on an intimate and profoundly knowledgeable partnership with the organic world, a way of making things that was predicated on a deep and practical understanding of the unique physical properties of the animal and plant materials that were available in the local environment. At the very heart of this technological system, the foundational craft upon which all others were in some way dependent, was the art and science of flint knapping, the complex and highly skilled process of shaping hard, crystalline stones like flint, chert, and obsidian into a vast and varied array of razor-sharp cutting tools. This was not a simple and brutish act of smashing rocks together, but was a controlled and intellectually demanding craft, a form of reductive sculpture that required a level of hand-eye coordination, a feel for the internal geometry of the stone, and a degree of foresight and planning that was akin to that of a master chess player. The knapper had to possess a deep, geological knowledge of the landscape, an understanding of where to find the highest quality raw materials, and the ability to assess the internal structure and potential of a rough, unprepared nodule of flint simply by observing its external form and by testing its weight and its percussive response. The process of tool manufacture was a carefully sequenced and highly structured operational chain, a series of distinct stages that transformed a block of raw material into a finished, functional, and often exquisitely beautiful artifact. The initial stage involved the rough shaping of the core, the parent piece of stone, a process of removing the outer, weathered cortex and of establishing a series of carefully prepared striking platforms from which the desired flakes or blades could then be detached. The second and most critical stage was the systematic removal of these flakes or blades, an act that was accomplished through a variety of sophisticated percussion and pressure techniques. Using a hammerstone of a precisely chosen weight and hardness, or a softer, more forgiving billet of antler or bone, the knapper would deliver a series of perfectly controlled blows to the edge of the striking platform, the force of the blow being carefully calibrated and its angle of incidence being minutely adjusted to detach a flake of a predetermined size and shape. The pinnacle of this technology was the production of long, thin, parallel-sided blades, a highly efficient and standardized form of stone tool blank that could be produced in large numbers from a single, carefully prepared blade core, a technique that was, in essence, a form of prehistoric mass production. The final stage of the process was the retouching and shaping of these primary flakes and blades into the specific, functional forms of the finished tools, a delicate and precise task that was often performed by the application of pressure with the tip of an antler tine, a technique that allowed for the removal of very small, fine flakes and the creation of a sharp, durable, and highly regular cutting edge. The variety of the finished tool types was immense, a specialized and highly differentiated toolkit that included the spear points and arrowheads used for hunting, the sharp-edged knives used for butchering and cutting hides, the stout, chisel-ended burins used for carving and engraving bone and antler, and the carefully shaped, rounded scrapers that were the essential, woman's tool for the laborious and never-ending task of processing animal hides. This entire technological system was not a static or unchanging tradition, but was a dynamic and constantly evolving one, with clear and archaeologically visible changes in the preferred techniques and the dominant tool forms over time and across different geographical regions, a silent and stony record of the restless, innovative, and deeply intelligent minds of the Ice Age technologists. The rich and symbolically complex world of Ice Age art, a vast and astonishingly sophisticated body of creative work that has been preserved for tens of thousands of years on the dark, silent walls of deep limestone caves and in the form of small, portable, and exquisitely carved objects of bone, antler, and ivory, represents one of the most profound and mysterious intellectual achievements of early humanity. This was not art for art's sake in the modern sense, a form of purely aesthetic or decorative expression, but was a deeply integrated and functionally essential component of the society's cultural and cosmological system, a powerful and highly charged symbolic technology that was used to explore, to understand, and to influence the workings of the unseen, supernatural world. The most famous and visually spectacular manifestation of this artistic tradition is the parietal or cave art, a series of vast and breathtakingly beautiful galleries of painted and engraved images that are found in the deep, subterranean cave systems of southwestern Europe, in sites such as Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain. The creation of these images in the absolute darkness and the profound, echoing silence of the deep earth was a deliberate and highly ritualized act, an undertaking that required a significant investment of time, resources, and specialized knowledge. The artists, who were likely a small and respected group of ritual specialists or shamans, used a limited but highly effective palette of natural mineral pigments, black from manganese oxide or charcoal, red and yellow from iron oxides, or ochres, which were ground into a fine powder and mixed with a binder, such as animal fat or saliva, to create a durable and long-lasting paint. This paint was then applied to the undulating and often highly suggestive rock surfaces of the cave walls, using a variety of techniques, from the simple application with the fingers to the use of moss pads or brushes made from animal hair, and in a remarkably sophisticated technique, by spraying the pigment directly from the mouth to create a soft, airbrushed effect. The subject matter of this art is both remarkably consistent and deeply revealing, a near-total and almost obsessive preoccupation with the great, powerful and economically vital animals of the Ice Age world: the bison, the wild horse, the mammoth, and the deer. These animals are not depicted as static, trophy-like figures, but are rendered with a stunning and almost photographic naturalism, a level of observational accuracy and an understanding of animal anatomy and movement that could only have been the product of a lifetime of intense and focused observation. The images are often dynamic and full of life, capturing the specific and characteristic posture of a grazing bison, the graceful and energetic line of a running horse, or the immense, shaggy bulk of a walking mammoth. Human figures, by contrast, are extremely rare in this art, and when they do appear, they are typically depicted in a highly schematic, stick figure-like style, a stark and deliberate contrast to the vibrant naturalism of the animal portraits. The placement of these images within the caves is also highly significant, with the most elaborate and powerful compositions often being located in the deepest, most remote and most acoustically resonant chambers of the cave, places that were difficult to access and which were clearly set apart from the world of everyday domestic life. The prevailing interpretation of this art is that it was not a simple record of the day's hunt or a form of sympathetic magic designed to ensure future success, but was part of a more complex and spiritually profound shamanistic worldview, in which the deep cave was understood to be a sacred and liminal space, a permeable membrane between the human world and the powerful, spirit-filled world of the supernatural, and the act of painting the animals on the walls was a ritualistic and visionary process, a way of making contact with, honoring and drawing power from the essential spiritual essence of the great and life-sustaining beast. The small, portable or mobiliary art of the period, the thousands of small, intricately carved figurines and decorated tools of bone and antler, reflects a similar set of concerns, a world in which the boundaries between the real and the symbolic, between the functional and the sacred, were fluid and often non-existent. The cognitive and linguistic abilities of the Ice Age human, the complex and largely invisible software that powered their sophisticated technological and social systems, were the product of a long and gradual process of neurological evolution that had culminated in the emergence of a brain that was, in its size, its structure, and its fundamental processing capacity, virtually indistinguishable from that of a modern human. The archaeological record, while silent on the specifics of the soft and perishable tissues of the brain itself, provides a rich and compelling body of indirect evidence for a mind that was capable of a level of abstract thought, of long-term planning, and of the complex, symbolic communication that is the universal and defining characteristic of our species. The very existence of the complex and highly standardized stone tool technologies, with their long and carefully sequenced operational chains and their clearly defined mental templates for the finished forms of the artifacts, is in itself a powerful argument for a mind that was capable of a high degree of foresight, of causal reasoning, and of the ability to transmit a complex set of procedural rules and concepts from one generation to the next through the medium of language. The successful execution of a large-scale, cooperative hunt, an activity that required the coordinated action of a large number of individuals, the communication of a detailed and collectively understood strategic plan, and the ability to adapt that plan in real time to the unpredictable and dynamic behavior of the prey, would have been an impossibility in the absence of a sophisticated and nuanced system of linguistic communication. The most profound and undeniable evidence for the fully modern and symbolically saturated nature of the Ice Age mind, however, is to be found in the rich and complex artistic and ritual traditions that were a central and pervasive feature of their culture. The creation of the great naturalistic murals on the walls of the deep caves was not the work of a mind that was solely preoccupied with the immediate and practical concerns of subsistence and survival, but was the product of a consciousness that was grappling with the great existential questions of life, death, and the nature of the cosmos, A mind that was capable of creating a complex and internally consistent mythological and cosmological system to explain and to give meaning to the world in which it found itself. The deliberate and highly patterned placement of these images within the caves, the recurring and clearly non-random association of certain animal species with certain types of locations or with certain abstract symbols, and the very act of venturing into the deep, dangerous, and otherworldly environment of the subterranean world to create these images, all point to a level of ritual and symbolic complexity that is the hallmark of a fully developed human intellect. The widespread and archaeologically documented practice of intentional burial of the dead is another powerful indicator of a mind that was capable of abstract, symbolic, and spiritual thought. The careful placement of the deceased in a prepared grave, often in a flexed or sleeping position, and the inclusion of so-called grave goods, such as personal ornaments, high-quality stone tools, or portions of animal meat, are behaviors that make little or no practical sense in a purely utilitarian framework, but which are deeply meaningful within a belief system that posits the existence of a soul or a spirit that continues to exist after the death of the physical body and which may require provisions for its journey into an afterlife. The occasional and highly significant discovery of graves that have been dusted with a thick layer of red ochre, a vibrant, blood-colored mineral pigment, is a particularly powerful and evocative piece of evidence for this kind of symbolic thought, a ritual act that was clearly intended to imbue the deceased with a sense of life, vitality, or sacred power. The language that was spoken by these people is, of course, lost to us forever, an ephemeral creation of breath and sound that has left no direct trace in the archaeological record. But the complex and deeply symbolic material world that they created and left behind is a silent but eloquent testament to the power and the modernity of the minds that conceived it. The physical and biological realities of the Ice Age human body, the flesh and bone machine that had to endure the relentless and unforgiving pressures of the glacial environment, were a product of the same long and demanding process of natural selection that had shaped their minds, a process that had resulted in the evolution of a set of physiological and anatomical adaptations that made them exceptionally well-suited to a life of high physical activity in a consistently and profoundly cold climate. The skeletal evidence, which is the most direct and durable source of information about the physical characteristics of these ancient people, reveals a population that was, on average, more robustly built, more heavily muscled, and possessed of a significantly greater bone density than the average modern human, a set of traits that were a direct and predictable biological response to a life of constant and strenuous physical exertion. The analysis of the long bones of the legs, for example, often shows the presence of a pronounced pilaster, a buttress of thickened bone that runs down the back of the femur, a feature that is a clear and unambiguous indicator of a life that involved a great deal of walking and running over difficult and uneven terrain. The bones of the upper body and the arms, particularly in the male skeletons, show the pronounced and often asymmetrical muscle attachment scars that are the signature of a lifetime of wielding heavy spears and of participating in the other, equally demanding physical tasks of the hunt. The overall picture that emerges from these silent, stony remains is one of a people who were, in a very real and measurable sense, elite athletes, their bodies conditioned from early childhood to a level of physical fitness and endurance that would be almost unimaginable to the average sedentary modern human. In addition to this generalized robustness, the skeletal remains from the colder, more northerly regions of the Ice Age world often display a set of more specific anatomical features that are consistent with the well-understood biological principles of adaptation to cold climates, a set of rules first articulated by the 19th century biologists Bergman and Allen. The bodies of these northern peoples, such as the classic Cro-Magnon populations of Europe, tended to be relatively short and stocky, with a broad torso and relatively short limbs, a body plan that is designed to minimize the surface area to volume ratio and thus to conserve body heat with the greatest possible efficiency. The skulls of these people often exhibit a relatively narrow and high nasal aperture, a feature that is believed to be an adaptation for warming and humidifying the cold, dry air of the glacial environment before it entered the sensitive tissues of the lungs. The teeth, which are often preserved in an exceptionally good and unworn condition due to a diet that was almost entirely free of the abrasive grains and the processed sugars that are the primary cause of dental decay in modern populations, were also used as a kind of all-purpose third hand, a versatile and powerful tool for gripping hides, for softening leather, and for preparing sinew and other fibrous materials, a use that is often clearly visible in the form of specific and patterned wear. On the front incisors. The general state of health of these populations as revealed by the skeletal record, was surprisingly good, with a notable absence of the types of chronic, degenerative diseases that are so common in the modern world, a testament to the benefits of a life of constant physical activity and a diet that was rich in protein and healthy animal fats. The primary and ever-present threat to life was not disease, but was the constant and unavoidable risk of physical trauma, the broken bones, the deep and potentially fatal wounds, and the other, more subtle injuries that were the inevitable and accepted occupational hazards of a life spent in close and violent proximity to the great and powerful beasts of the Ice Age world. The sensory world of the Ice Age human was a profoundly different and in many ways more intensely experienced reality than that of the modern, urban-dwelling individual, a world in which the five senses were not merely passive receptors of information but were the essential and highly refined tools of a continuous and life-or-death process of environmental monitoring. In a world that was devoid of the constant, low-level and largely meaningless sensory clutter of our own time, the incessant background noise of traffic, the ubiquitous and distracting glow of artificial lights, the processed and artificial flavors of industrial food, the human sensory apparatus was capable of a level of acuity and a subtlety of interpretation that is now almost entirely lost to us. The sense of hearing, which was not constantly assaulted and dulled by the din of the modern world, was a critical and long-range early warning system, an acoustic radar that was in a state of constant and vigilant operation, day and night. The hunter, lying awake in the profound, echoing silence of the Ice Age night, would have been able to hear, to identify, and to interpret a vast and complex symphony of sounds that would be entirely inaudible or incomprehensible to a modern ear. The distant, almost subaudible crunch of a large animal's hooves on the frozen snow, the subtle and almost imperceptible shift in the tone of the wind that might signal a change in the weather, the high-pitched, almost ultrasonic clicks of a hunting bat, or the deep, resonant and ground-shaking infrasound communications of a herd of mammoths many miles away. The ability to distinguish between the sound of a falling rock and the sound of a stealthily approaching predator, or between the normal ambient noises of the landscape and the subtle, anomalous sound that might indicate the presence of a hidden danger or a hidden opportunity, was a skill that was honed and refined over a lifetime and which was an essential and non-negotiable component of the individual's survival toolkit. The sense of sight was similarly attuned to a different and more demanding set of priorities, a way of seeing that was focused not on the recognition of the static, human-made symbols and texts of our world, but on the detection of the subtle and often fleeting patterns of movement, color and texture that were the essential language of the natural world. The hunter's eye was a powerful and highly trained instrument of pattern recognition, capable of scanning the vast, monotonous and often blindingly white expanse of the snow-covered tundra and instantly detecting the tiny, anomalous speck of dark fur that might indicate the presence of a distant prey animal, or of noticing the slight and almost invisible disturbance in the texture of the snow that was the telltale sign of a recently passed animal's track. The ability to read these tracks was a complex and highly developed science in its own right, a form of forensic analysis that could reveal a vast amount of information about the animal that had made them. Its species, its size, its sex, the speed at which it was traveling, and the amount of time that had elapsed since its passage. The hunter's visual world was also a world of a profoundly different and more intense color palette, a world that was dominated for much of the year by the almost overwhelming and undifferentiated whiteness of the snow and the ice, a condition that created a constant risk of the painful and temporarily disabling condition of snow blindness, a danger that was likely mitigated by the use of simple but effective snow goggles, which were typically carved from a flat piece of bone or ivory with a narrow horizontal slit that would reduce the amount of reflected ultraviolet light that could enter the eye. The sense of smell, which for modern humans is often a neglected and underutilized sense, was for the Ice Age hunter a primary and highly reliable source of information about the immediate environment, a chemical reconnaissance system that was in a state of continuous and unconscious operation. The ability to detect the faint, musky scent of a prey animal on the wind, to distinguish between the smell of a fresh kill and the smell of an old, decaying carcass, or to recognize the sharp, almost metallic scent that often precedes a lightning storm, were all vital and life-saving skills in a world where the available information was often sparse, ambiguous, and delivered in the most subtle of forms. This intense and multi-sensory immersion in the physical world was not a choice but a necessity, a state of being in which the human organism was not a detached observer of nature, but was a fully integrated and deeply interconnected component of a complex and dynamic ecosystem. The concept of time for the Ice Age human was not the linear, abstract, and minutely subdivided system of the modern clock-governed world, but was a more fluid, cyclical, and deeply experiential phenomenon, a way of measuring and of being in time that was inextricably linked to the great, recurring, and biologically significant rhythms of the natural world. The primary and most fundamental of these cycles was the simple and inescapable alternation of day and night, a rhythm that was rendered even more dramatic and significant by the profound and almost absolute darkness that descended upon the landscape with the setting of the sun. The day was the time of labor, of movement, and of the hunt, a period of intense and focused activity that was dictated by the availability of the natural light that was essential for navigating the landscape and for performing the complex, visually demanding tasks of the society. The night, by contrast, was a time of enforced inactivity, of confinement, and of a deep and almost total sensory deprivation, a long, dark, and often cold period that was spent in the relative safety of the shelter, in the small and flickering circle of light cast by the central hearth. The passage of time during the day was not measured by the abstract and arbitrary divisions of hours and minutes, but by the slow, majestic, and entirely predictable arc of the sun across the sky, a natural and universally understood chronometer that provided all the information that was needed to regulate the daily round of activities. The position of the sun in the sky would indicate the optimal time to begin the day's hunt, the point of midday when a brief rest might be taken, and the critical, late afternoon moment when it was necessary to begin the journey back to the safety of the camp before the swift and unforgiving onset of the darkness. Superimposed upon this primary diurnal cycle was the larger, more complex, and equally important rhythm of the lunar month, a cycle that was marked by the slow, predictable, and deeply symbolic waxing and waning of the moon. The different phases of the moon provided a convenient and universally understood way of marking the passage of longer periods of time, and the full moon, which would have bathed the frozen, snow-covered landscape in a brilliant and ethereal silver light, was likely a time of great social and ritual significance, a period when movement at night was possible and when communal gatherings and ceremonies might have been held. The largest and most significant of all the temporal cycles, the one that governed the entire strategic and economic life of the society, was the great, annual rhythm of the seasons. This was not the familiar four-season cycle of the temperate latitudes, but was a more stark and dramatic alternation between two profoundly different and mutually exclusive worlds: the long, dark, and frozen world of the winter, and the short, intense, and explosively productive world of the summer. The transition between these two states was the most critical and anxiously awaited moment of the entire year, a period of profound and often dangerous instability. As the great ice sheets began to melt, the rivers broke free from their frozen stasis, and the great, life-sustaining herds of the migratory animals began their long and predictable journey from their wintering grounds in the south to their summer calving grounds in the north. The entire social and economic calendar of the hunter-gatherer group was organized around this single, pivotal event, and the ability to accurately predict its timing and to position the band in the right place at the right time to intercept the migrating herds was the single most important strategic decision that the group's leaders had to make. This deep and intimate entanglement with the recurring biological rhythms of the planet was a fundamentally different way of experiencing time, a state of being in which the human life was not a linear progression from birth to death, but was a continuous and recurring participation in the great, ancient, and unending cycles of the cosmos. The transmission of the vast and complex body of knowledge that was the essential and non-negotiable prerequisite for survival in the Ice Age world was a process that was entirely dependent on the power and the fidelity of the human mind, a system of education that was based not on the written word, but on the rich, multisensory, and deeply personal media of oral tradition and direct, hands-on apprenticeship. In a society that was entirely without literacy, the accumulated wisdom of the generations, the detailed mental maps of the landscape, the encyclopedic knowledge of the animal world, the complex and carefully sequenced procedures for the manufacture of tools, and the rich and symbolically dense tapestry of the people's mythology and cosmology, was stored not on an external and inanimate medium, but in the living and constantly evolving repository of the collective memory of the community. The primary vehicle for the preservation and the transmission of this vital cultural information was the spoken word, in the form of stories, songs, and long rhythmically chanted genealogies and epic poems. These were not simple entertaining fictions, but were highly structured and mnemonically powerful pedagogical tools, a kind of oral encyclopedia that encoded the society's most important practical and spiritual knowledge in a form that was both memorable and easily transmissible. A story about the great, primordial hunt of a mythical culture hero, for example, would not only serve to entertain and to reinforce the society's core values, but would also contain, embedded within its narrative structure, a wealth of detailed and practical information about the behavior of a particular prey species, the specific geographical locations of the best hunting grounds, and the correct ritual procedures that had to be performed to ensure a successful outcome. This process of oral education began in the earliest moments of a child's life, as he or she sat by the central hearth in the long dark hours of the winter night, listening to the endlessly repeated stories and songs of the elders. This was not a passive or incidental process of learning, but was an active and deeply immersive one, in which the child was not only a recipient of the information but was also a participant in its preservation, his or her own developing memory being slowly and systematically populated with the essential cultural software of the group. As the child grew older, this foundational education in the oral traditions of the people was supplemented by a more direct and intensely practical form of learning, a long and gradual apprenticeship in the specific and gender-differentiated skills that he or she would need to master in order to become a competent and productive adult member of the society. A young boy would begin to accompany his father and the other men of the band on short hunting and foraging trips, at first as a silent and largely passive observer, his role being simply to watch, to listen, and to absorb the complex and often subtle details of the hunter's craft. He would learn, by a process of direct and repeated demonstration, how to identify the almost invisible tracks of an animal on the frozen ground, how to move with the requisite silence and stealth, and how to read the subtle and ever-changing language of the wind. Later he would be given his own child-sized set of tools and weapons and would be allowed to participate in the hunt in a more active, though still peripheral role, perhaps by helping to drive a smaller and less dangerous animal towards the waiting spears of the senior hunters. A young girl, by contrast, would undergo a parallel and equally demanding apprenticeship in the domestic and productive arts of the women, learning at her mother's and her grandmother's side the complex and multi-stage process of transforming a raw, bloody animal hide into a soft, pliable, and weatherproof piece of leather, the intricate and precise techniques of sewing with a fine bone needle and a thread of sinew, and the deep, botanical knowledge of the local plant life that was necessary for gathering the edible roots, the medicinal herbs, and the fibrous materials that were used for making cordage and baskets. This entire system of education was a slow, patient, and deeply personal one, a process that was predicated not on the abstract and decontextualized acquisition of information, but on the holistic and deeply embodied development of a practical, lived competence in the real and unforgiving world. The spiritual and emotional life of the Ice Age individual was shaped by a profound and ever-present sense of intimacy with and dependence upon the non-human world, a worldview that did not recognize the sharp and unbridgeable Cartesian dualism between the human and the natural that has come to define the modern Western consciousness. The world, for the Ice Age hunter, was not an inanimate and meaningless collection of physical resources to be exploited, but was a vast and sentient community of living beings, a complex and interconnected web of life in which the human was only one, and not necessarily the most powerful, of a multitude of intelligent and volitional actors. The animals, the plants, the rivers, and the very stones of the landscape were all understood to be possessed of their own unique forms of consciousness, their own spiritual essences, and their own distinct and powerful personalities. This animistic worldview, which is a near-universal feature of hunter-gatherer societies across the globe, fostered a relationship with the natural world that was based not on a principle of domination and control, but on a more complex and deeply respectful set of protocols that were akin to the rules of diplomacy between two powerful and independent nations. The hunt, in this conceptual framework, was not a simple secular act of predation, but was a complex and highly ritualized negotiation between the human and the animal worlds, a sacred and dangerous transaction in which the animal was not simply taken by force, but was believed, in some sense, to have willingly and consciously offered itself to the hunter. This fundamental belief in the personhood of the non-human world required that the act of killing be accompanied by a series of carefully prescribed and deeply serious ritual actions that were designed to honor the spirit of the slain animal and to ensure that it would be willing to return in the future to once again offer itself as a source of life for the people. After a successful kill, the hunters might perform a short and simple ceremony of thanksgiving, in which they would offer a prayer or a small, symbolic gift, such as a sprinkling of sacred ochre, to the spirit of the animal they had just killed. The butchering of the carcass was also a process that was governed by a set of ritual prohibitions and prescriptions, with certain parts of the animal, such as the skull or the heart, often being treated with a special reverence and being set aside to be disposed of in a ritually prescribed manner, perhaps by being placed in a sacred tree or by being returned to a river. The consumption of the animal's flesh was itself a kind of communion, a sacred act in which the life force of the animal was ingested and incorporated into the bodies of the human beings who had consumed it, a process that served to blur the boundaries between the two and to reinforce the deep and unbreakable bond of interdependence that existed between them. The relationship with the animal world was therefore a profoundly ambivalent and psychologically complex one, a mixture of deep, spiritual reverence and a pragmatic and unsentimental willingness to kill. The hunter felt a genuine and deeply held respect for the power, the intelligence, and the spiritual essence of the great beast that he pursued, but this respect did not in any way preclude the absolute and non-negotiable necessity of taking their lives in order to sustain his own. This complex and emotionally demanding worldview, with its constant and simultaneous awareness of the sacredness and the instrumentality of the natural world, was the psychological and spiritual bedrock of the Ice Age hunter's existence. A way of being in the world that was predicated on a deep and abiding sense of humility and a profound and ever-present recognition of the fragile and contingent nature of human life. The archaeological evidence for the health and the demography of the Ice Age populations, which is derived almost entirely from the small and scattered sample of human skeletal remains that have survived the ravages of time, paints a picture of a life that was, in many ways, a stark and brutal paradox. On the one hand, the individuals who survived the exceptionally high risks of infancy and childhood in this unforgiving environment appear to have been, on the whole, remarkably healthy and robust, their bodies largely free from the chronic, degenerative diseases and the nutritional deficiencies that would become the hallmarks of later, agricultural societies. The skeletal remains show a near-total absence of the dental cavities and the periodontal disease that are the direct and predictable consequence of a diet that is high in carbohydrates and processed sugars, a testament to the benefits of the high-protein, high-fat, and low-sugar diet of the Ice Age hunter. The bones themselves are typically thick, dense, and well-formed, showing few signs of the pathologies that are associated with chronic malnutrition, such as rickets or osteoporosis. The evidence for infectious disease is more ambiguous, but it is likely that the small size and the high mobility of the hunter-gatherer bands would have acted as a natural and highly effective brake on the spread of the kind of devastating, crowd-dependent epidemic diseases that would later plague the dense, sedentary, and unhygienic populations of the first cities and states. The most common and recurring pathologies that are visible on these ancient skeletons are not those of disease, but are the unmistakable and often dramatic signatures of a life of constant, strenuous physical activity and a high risk of traumatic injury. The bones of both men and women consistently show the signs of advanced and often debilitating osteoarthritis, a degenerative joint disease that was the inevitable and cumulative result of a lifetime of walking, running, carrying heavy loads, and performing the other repetitive and physically demanding tasks of their daily lives. The evidence for acute, traumatic injury is also ubiquitous and often shockingly severe. The skeletal record is filled with examples of well-healed, and in many cases poorly healed, bone fractures, a silent and stony testament to the frequent and unavoidable dangers of a life that was lived in close and often violent proximity to the great and powerful beasts of the glacial world. A significant percentage of the adult male skeletons show the evidence of multiple healed fractures to the ribs, the arms, and the skull, a pattern of injury that is eerily similar to that which is seen today in the skeletons of professional rodeo riders, and which is the unmistakable signature of a life that involved frequent and violent collisions with large, angry animals. The fact that many of these injuries, which would have been completely incapacitating and almost certainly fatal for an individual who was left to fend for himself, show clear and unambiguous signs of having healed, often over a period of many months or even years, is in itself a powerful and deeply moving piece of evidence for the social and emotional world of these ancient people. The survival of an individual with a severely broken leg or a crushed pelvis would have been an impossibility without the constant and long-term care of the other members of his or her social group, a level of care that would have involved the feeding, the cleaning, and the protection of the injured person for a prolonged period of almost total helplessness. The skeletal record is therefore a silent but eloquent testament to the deep and powerful bonds of compassion and mutual obligation that were the essential and unbreakable glue that held these small and fragile communities together. The other, darker side of this demographic paradox is the stark and unavoidable evidence for a life that was, on average, brutally and unforgivingly short. While it was certainly possible for an individual to live into what we would now consider to be old age, with some skeletons showing evidence of survival into their 50s or even their 60s, the vast majority of the population did not. The average life expectancy at birth was likely to have been in the low 30s, a number that was heavily skewed by an exceptionally high rate of infant and child mortality, and for those who did manage to survive into adulthood, the constant and ever-present risks of the hunt, of childbirth, and of the simple, unglamorous, and unavoidable accidents of daily life meant that a sudden and violent death was a far more common and expected fate than a slow and peaceful decline into old age. The final and most profound transition of the Ice Age, the slow and geologically inexorable process of deglaciation that brought the long, cold reign of the Pleistocene to a close, was not a simple and welcome return to a warmer and more bountiful world, but was a period of profound, chaotic, and often deeply disruptive environmental and ecological change, a global transformation that presented a new and in many ways more complex set of adaptive challenges to the human populations that were forced to navigate it. The process, which was driven by a slow and cyclical change in the Earth's orbit and its axial tilt, began around 20,000 years ago, and it was characterized by a gradual, though often erratic and unpredictable, increase in the planet's average temperature. The most dramatic and visible consequence of this global warming was the slow and unstoppable melting of the great continental ice sheets that had for so long smothered the northern latitudes. As these colossal 2-mile-thick mountains of ice began to retreat, they released a truly unimaginable quantity of fresh water into the world's oceans, a process that resulted in a dramatic and geologically rapid rise in the global sea level, a rise of some 400 feet that completely and irrevocably redrew the coastlines of the continents. The vast, low-lying coastal plains that had once been some of the richest and most productive hunting grounds on the planet, such as the area that is now the North Sea, were slowly and inexorably inundated, forcing the human and animal populations that had lived there to retreat inland into ever-shrinking and increasingly crowded territories. The melting of the ice also had a profound and dramatic effect on the inland landscapes, as the retreating glaciers carved deep, fjord-like valleys, scoured the bedrock, and left behind a chaotic and jumbled terrain of moraines, eskers, and vast proglacial lakes, a world that was in a constant and often violent state of flux. This dramatic and far-reaching transformation of the physical world was accompanied by an equally profound and disruptive reorganization of the planet's biological systems. The vast, open, and relatively uniform ecosystem of the glacial steppe, with its low diversity of plant life and its immense, continent-spanning herds of large, gregarious herbivores, began to break apart and to be replaced by a more complex, more fragmented and more regionally varied mosaic of new and expanding ecosystems. The most significant of these was the forest. As the climate continued to warm and to become more humid, The hardy, cold-adapted grasses and sedges of the tundra were slowly but surely replaced by the inexorable, northward advance of the boreal and the temperate forests, a slow-motion invasion of trees that completely and fundamentally transformed the nature of the landscape, the structure of the animal communities, and the entire strategic and economic basis of the human hunter-gatherer way of life. The great open country herds of the mammoth, the bison, and the wild horse, which had been the dietary and economic mainstays of the Ice Age populations, found their vast, unbroken grazing lands becoming increasingly fragmented and constricted by the encroaching forests, a process that, when combined with the continued and perhaps increasing pressure from the highly skilled and well-equipped human hunters, led to a cascade of extinctions that would, by the end of the transition, see the complete and final disappearance of a large percentage of the Great Pleistocene megafauna. The human groups that had for so long been the masters of this open and predictable world were now faced with a stark and non-negotiable choice. They could either retreat to the north, following the last shrinking remnants of their familiar tundra environment, or they could stay and attempt to adapt to the new, strange, and in many ways more challenging world of the forest, a world that was darker, more closed in, and which was populated by a new and more elusive suite of smaller, solitary, and forest-dwelling animals such as the red deer, the roe deer, and the wild boar, a world that would require the development of a completely new set of technologies, a new set of economic strategies, and a new way of seeing and of being in the world. The human response to the profound and multifaceted environmental disruptions of the terminal Pleistocene was not a single, uniform, and predictable reaction, but was instead a complex and highly varied mosaic of different adaptive strategies. A period of intense and often rapid cultural and technological innovation that saw the development of new and more specialized ways of life that were specifically tailored to the unique challenges and opportunities of the emerging post-glacial world. In the far northern latitudes of Europe and Asia, some human groups chose to follow the retreating ice and the shrinking remnants of the cold steppe ecosystem, a strategy that allowed them to maintain for a time a version of the traditional and highly successful big-game hunting way of life that had served their ancestors so well for so long. These specialized reindeer hunters of the late glacial and early post-glacial periods developed a highly mobile and logistically complex settlement and subsistence system that was exquisitely attuned to the predictable, long-distance, seasonal migrations of their primary prey. They established a series of strategically located and seasonally occupied camps along the major migration routes, intercepting the vast herds at critical points on their journey, such as river crossings and narrow mountain passes, a hunting strategy that allowed them to harvest a large number of animals in a relatively short period of time and which provided them with the resources to sustain their communities through the rest of the year. The material culture of these societies, as seen in the archaeological record of sites such as those of the Ahrensbergian culture in northern Germany, reflects this intense and almost total specialization, with a toolkit that was dominated by the small, tanged projectile points that were used to arm the arrows that were likely shot from a powerful new piece of technology, the bow, a weapon that was far better suited to the hunting of the fast-moving and wary reindeer than the heavy, thrusting spear of the earlier mammoth hunters. In the more southerly and temperate regions of the world, where the transition to a fully forested environment was more rapid and more complete, the human populations were forced to engage in a more radical and far-reaching process of adaptation, a shift that is often referred to by archaeologists as the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age. This was a period that was characterized by a broad and fundamental reorientation of the subsistence economy, a move away from the high-risk, high-return strategy of the specialized big-game hunter and towards a more diversified, lower-risk and more labor-intensive strategy of broad-spectrum foraging. The human groups of the Mesolithic learned to exploit a much wider and more varied range of food resources, a diet that included not only the smaller, solitary, and more elusive animals of the new forest environment, such as the red deer and the wild boar, but also a host of other, previously neglected or underutilized resources, such as fish, shellfish, birds, and a wide variety of edible plants, including nuts, seeds, and roots. This economic diversification was accompanied by and dependent upon a significant and corresponding diversification of the technological toolkit. The large, standardized, and often beautifully crafted stone blades of the late Ice Age were largely replaced by a new and highly pragmatic stone tool technology that was based on the production of vast numbers of tiny, geometrically shaped microliths, small and highly standardized blades and points of flint that were designed to be used not as tools in themselves, but as the interchangeable and easily replaceable components of more complex, composite tools. These microliths were set in rows into a groove that had been carved into a larger handle or shaft of bone or wood, where they were held in place with a natural adhesive like birch bark tar, a technique that allowed for the creation of a wide variety of highly specialized and efficient tools, such as the barbed and serrated points of a fishing harpoon or the sharp, continuous cutting edge of a sickle that was used for harvesting wild grasses. This new, flexible and highly efficient technology was a perfect adaptation to a world in which the economic targets were smaller, more varied and more widely dispersed, a world that rewarded not the specialized knowledge of the big game hunter, but the generalized and encyclopedic knowledge of the broad-spectrum forager. The culmination of this long and complex process of post-glacial adaptation, the final and most profound and irreversible of all the transformations that were triggered by the end of the Ice Age, was the independent and roughly simultaneous development, in several different parts of the world, of a completely new and revolutionary way of life: agriculture. The slow and gradual shift from a purely extractive and mobile economy of hunting and gathering to a productive and sedentary economy based on the deliberate cultivation of domesticated plants and the herding of domesticated animals was not an invention, in the sense of a single brilliant discovery, but was a long, slow and largely unintentional process of ecological and evolutionary entanglement, a process in which the human species and a small and select group of plants and animals became locked into a relationship of ever-increasing and mutually reinforcing codependence. In the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, which had been a minor but reliable component of the late Ice Age foragers' diet, began to be more and more intensively managed and cultivated, a process that, over the course of many generations of unconscious and then conscious selection, led to the evolution of the fully domesticated forms of these essential cereal grains. A similar and parallel process of coevolution was taking place between the human hunters and the wild sheep, goats and cattle of the region, a relationship that slowly transitioned from one of simple predation to one of active and interventionist herd management, and which eventually culminated in the emergence of the fully domesticated and behaviorally transformed animals that would become the foundation of the pastoral economy. This new agricultural way of life, with its promise of a more stable and predictable food supply, had a series of profound and largely unforeseen consequences for the structure and the nature of human society. The need to tend to the newly planted fields and to the increasingly sedentary herds of livestock required a fundamental and unprecedented shift from a life of high mobility to one of permanent and year-round settlement, a change that led to the establishment of the first, small and permanent villages. The ability to produce and, more importantly, to store a surplus of food for the first time in human history created the economic and social conditions for a rapid and sustained growth in the human population, and it also laid the foundations for the emergence of new and more complex forms of social and political organization, as the need to manage the stored surplus and to regulate the increasingly complex and potentially conflict-ridden relationships within the larger, sedentary communities, led to the development of the first rudimentary forms of institutionalized leadership and social hierarchy. The end of the Ice Age, therefore, was not simply the end of a particular and very long chapter in the human story, but was the beginning of a completely new and in many ways more challenging and more dangerous one, the beginning of the long, complex, and often violent and unequal story of civilization itself. As the weight of sleep slowly closes your eyelids, let your imagination wander through the ages in your dreams. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to like it. There are more boring history stories to help you fall asleep. See you at bedtime. Goodbye.